Welcome to In the Funnel. My name is Mark Cox. In the Funnel is a group of sales coaches and consultants that help B2B sales teams dramatically improve revenue. Clients come to us when revenue growth is stagnated, or their sales team is not meeting expectations, or they need to recalibrate their sales and go-to-market plan for the upcoming year. Our clients have enjoyed tremendous success working within the funnel, and please hear it straight from them by listening to the testimonial section of this website. What they'll tell you is there's two things that make us unique and different in our space. Number one, we have a process and a methodology. First, for understanding your current state, and then second, for building your sales and go-to-market plan for the upcoming year. The second thing that makes us unique and different is that everybody within the funnel has run a material sales organization in their recent past. We're all practitioners. We don't have any theorists or teachers, and what that means is we can get in front of your sales team and run the next sales meeting, or join them on their next sales call to close your next large prospect. All of us have a passion for professional, disciplined, process-driven sales, and we'd be delighted to talk to you if you're looking to grow revenue for your company. Please feel free to reach out to us through this website at info@inthefunnel.com or by telephone. Thanks for taking the time to watch this.
If you look back at the last decade or the last 3 decades, actually, we had an annual inflation of 2%. That means the sales person had to go once per year to the customer and ask for a modest price increase of 2%. Now let me take 2 leading tire manufacturers. Michelin, that's a global market leader, and Conti, that's a large German company. They've already increased their price 4 times this year.
Wow.
And are announcing further increases for the next month. Now imagine the poor sales guy coming to the customer and I was here months ago and now I come again with a price increase. And that, David, has two sides. One is, what does the salesperson communicate? And I think you have to try to shift him or her as much as possible to value communication. Because only if they can communicate a higher value, superior value, the customer is willing to accept a price increase.
Hey, David, thanks again for joining for the podcast here today.
Pleased to be here, Mark. It's my 3rd time, so maybe it's 3 strikes and you're out.
Well, we'll let the listeners decide that. Hey, listen, how excited are you for today's conversation with Herman?
Well, I mean, I'm super excited. I mean, whenever you can get one of the top 50 thinkers on a one-on-one situation where you could ask them anything you want in regards to his area of expertise, I mean, who wouldn't be excited? It's almost like a dream come true, Mark.
Well, I felt the same way the first time I had the privilege of having him on the show, David. So folks, it's Hermann Simon, and he's the founder, he's the honorary chairman of Simon-Kucher Partners, 1,400 employees, 26 countries. These are global experts in pricing. And Herman himself is an expert in strategy, marketing, and pricing. He's the only German in the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame of the most important management thinkers in the world. And in German-speaking countries, he's continuously been voted the most influential living management thinker since 2005. He's got 36 books now in 27 different languages. And the one that's going to be coming out a month after you hear this podcast is called Beating Inflation. Beating Inflation. How relevant is that? But we've talked to him in the past about Confessions of the Pricing Man, True Profit, Hidden Champions of the 21st Century, and even Power Pricing. And the list goes on and on and on. And David, you start to think about someone who's written 36 books. It exhausts me thinking about that list, let alone writing the books.
Well, absolutely, Mark. And one of the things that you like to talk about as far as your value proposition exercise is how are you unique and different? And I think to me, what makes Herman unique and different than some of the other options that are out there is his simplicity, his way of helping guys like me and you understand some really complex pricing theory. And that to me is something that is very difficult to do. And he really seems to capture that. That's why I think I'm so excited about today, because I know that after today, I'm going to for sure, and anybody listening will definitely get a tip or two that they can put into action right away.
Well, you know what? Let's plan on those tips. It's such a great point, David. I'm going to ask him about, inflation. What exactly is it? How do we measure it? When was the last time we faced, 8 to 10% inflation? And what are the implications? I think there's some companies that do well, some companies aren't going to do well. I'm also really interested, David, I'm not sure about you, but I'm really interested to understand how long are we going to be in this? What exactly caused it and what can get us out of it? And as always, when you're on the line, I love your positivity. I want to figure out, how is this an opportunity for the CEOs or the sales leaders or the salespeople out there? How do we take what some might see as a crisis, but really view it through that lens of opportunity?
Yeah, for sure, Mark. I think all those are great and really something I'd want to know about as well too. And the only other thing I'm looking to get out of this personally is, what do we do with our sales folks, and how do we keep them excited and engaged and not feeling the pressure of the increases, but to be able to be armed in a way that they can go out there and really handle it professionally and recognize these opportunities that I think are going to come up because of inflation. So I'm going to really be excited to hear what Herman has to say about that today.
Yeah, me too. Hey, listen, David, obviously it's going to be a great conversation. Let's get at it with Hermann Simon. Herman, welcome back to the show. We're so delighted to see you again.
Hi, Mark.
So team, I am once again joined by my teammate, David Fauser, who's joining us today while running a sales organization of 150 deep for the second largest refrigeration company in the world. And Herman, I'm so excited to speak to you today because you may not recall, but the last time we had you on the show was the day after you'd finalized arrangements for your new book, Beating Inflation. You actually mentioned it.
I remember that well.
Back in April. So we're so excited to be talking about this really complex topic, because I think a lot of the mid-sized CEOs listening to the show today, a lot of the sales leaders, they're wondering, given everything they're hearing about inflation, how is that going to impact our business, our profitability? Is it a crisis? Is it an opportunity? So lots of wonderful things to unpack here, but maybe to just jump in and get started, how do we define the inflation we're going through this time? There's different types: demand pull, cost push, just built-in inflation. What type of inflation are we experiencing right now? And why are we experiencing this level of inflation?
Let me try to explain what inflation is. When you ask people, they say everything is getting more expensive, prices are going up. But that's not really inflation. Inflation is devaluation of the money. So the money is becoming a perishable good, more precisely, the fiat money, the paper money we have today. And to explain this, if you take a different kind of money, namely gold, for an ounce of gold, you could buy a custom-made tunica in Rome 2,000 years ago. For an ounce of gold, you can buy a custom-made suit today. The value of the product has not changed. What has changed is the value of the money. And one implication is you have to get your money as quickly as possible and then to get rid of it as quickly as possible by investing it in something which retains the value. So your products or your materials or something else. So this is a direct consequence of the perishability of money, like it's with fruit. You buy it early when it's still fresh and then you consume it and don't let it spoil.
What an
So I hope
amazing.
that contributes to the understanding what inflation is really is devaluation, perishing of money.
It does actually, what a great analogy, by the way, and even someone like me can understand it. And so, Herman, when we think of this, when we think of the inflation we're facing right now, what's causing it? People like me might remember we printed a lot of money during the financial crisis way back when. We might remember that we probably printed lots of money during the start of COVID. We're facing some other factors right now, Russia and so forth, but what's causing the inflation we're all experiencing right now, at least in North America and Europe?
Yeah, there are two causes, two categories of causes. One are the short-term causes like COVID-19, bottlenecks, global supply chain problems, lockdown in China, and the Ukraine war.
Okay.
These causes will disappear within, say, 2 or 3 years. If you think, for instance, of electronic chips, there are many factories under construction now, which will come on stream in 2 or 3 years, and then the bottlenecks, supply limits of electronic chips are over. And the second category is the one you addressed, the money volume. Since 2010, the financial crisis, the supply of money has tripled.
Oh, wow.
And the GDPs have only increased by 30%. So there is too much money chasing too few goods, and that means prices are going up. And the difference between the two categories of causes is very important. The first one is going to disappear 2 or 3 years. So you could say inflation will last for 2 or 3 years. The extremely blown up money supply will not disappear within this time period. That will take 10 years because the central bank, especially in Europe, cannot raise interest rates to a level which would really bring back the money supply in a short term. So I expect from these considerations that we will see inflation for the next 10 years or so, very similar to what we saw in the 70s. And one difference between then and now is that our managers today, they are as young as David, they haven't experienced the inflation. I still experienced it. I wrote my doctoral dissertation actually about this topic in 1973. And this inflation 50 years ago lasted 10 years. And I expect a similar development for this decade.
So Herman, I'm not as young as David, unfortunately, but I was a child in the 70s too. And
I meant manager David Forzer.
Exactly right. No, exactly, David.
He was not a manager in the 70s, I assume.
He certainly wasn't. But when we were children in the 70s, at least when I was a child in the 70s, I remember there's the things I remember, very unpleasant things happening. If memory serves, that was the Carter administration in the US, and he was going through lots of challenges. It was always the economy. What are the types of things that we should be expecting? Because we haven't lived through this for so long. What happens? What are the major things that happen to an economy during those types of inflationary times?
Yeah, for instance, interest rates go up. When I built my first house in 1981, I paid 12% interest on the mortgage.
Wow.
12%. In the recent years, people paid 1% in Germany and 2%, 1 point something in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And now assume you buy or build a house and you have a monthly commitment. And if the interest rate is 5, 7, 8%, you can no longer afford the same thing you could afford a year ago. So we will have a direct effect coming from the increase of the interest rate. Then, of course, the prices for material, for energy, for everything go up. And the big challenge is, can we as companies, as entrepreneurs, pass these cost increases through to the customers, be it B2B customers or B2C? Plus, a very important consequence is, inflation does not only affect the sales force or the people who have to implement the price, negotiate the price increases, it affects every function. Let me just take purchasing. The normal task of purchasing is to get the products we need, the materials at the lowest possible price. But now we have a situation where purchasing is responsible for getting the products at all. I was talking of electronic chips.
Right.
And so they don't have much negotiation power. If the customer says, if you don't want them, I have many others who are willing to pay the price. So the overall responsibility to keep the company operating is with the purchasing function. If they can't get the product, we have to close. Some automotive companies have to close down their plants because they don't have the smallest electronic part is missing. You cannot deliver the car. So it has a lot of very major, very strong consequences.
Well, we think that we've got David Fauser here today from Simco Refrigeration. You know, industrial manufacturing of these refrigeration units, they've experienced that. What have you been feeling recently, David, on the supply chain side of things?
Well, you know, as Herman was saying, it's very complex on the supply chain. And I think that I've seen a huge shift of, you know, really trying to, we don't want to take that hard stance, like the take it or leave it, because I'm always afraid of the long-term consequences of that, you know, but we do have to raise the prices, but we have to be really sharp about it in regards to what else is happening in the market, for sure. I'm starting to see it sort of free up a little bit more on the supply chain side, but there certainly isn't very much negotiation. Like, I really don't feel like the buyer I was 2 years ago, for example, dealing with everybody. So I'd say that's a real challenge. So Herman, like, you know, from in the 1970s, I was really curious as I was hearing you talking and seeing some of the things that are happening. Did a lot of companies go out of business in the 1970s and then new companies emerged? Is that one of the effects of this massive inflation that happens?
Yeah, that will certainly be one of the effects. And the distinction is defined by the pricing power a company has. Does it have the ability, the strength, the power to pass on the cost increases to the customers? And that never works to the full extent. Our experience from Simon-Kucher Partners, we are the global leader in price consulting, is that you can recover about 50% of the cost increases by increasing your prices. About 20 to 25% you have to recover by increasing your efficiency, by bringing costs down. And the remaining 25% or so you have to swallow, at least for the time being, until the situation normalizes again. So roughly, you can recover 50% of the cost increase. It differs, of course, from industry to industry. 20% to 25% cost reductions by automation, by whatever, and 25% you may have to swallow. And another observation is that there are extreme differences across industries. Let me just give you a crazy example. A friend of mine asked me, why has the price for tomatoes increased so much? 40%, 50%. And I explained it to him. Tomatoes are energy. In Europe, tomatoes are produced in huge greenhouses, which have a huge energy consumption. So it's practically water and energy. And that's why the price, which is not your first thought, why are tomatoes affected? Yeah, because they are condensed energy.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that happens in our house quite frequently. I think I've shared with you before, Herman. My wife, beautiful wife, will come home and talk about the cost of an avocado. Can you believe it's $6? And we just agreed to go on a trip to Italy for our 20th wedding anniversary. The cost of that trip knocked me over. Didn't faze her at all. She was quite comfortable with those numbers, but it's the cost of an avocado that kind of kills you. We're happy to spend any amount of money to go to Italy. So
avocado is an interesting example. In Europe, they are mostly grown in Spain. And there they don't have the energy, but the water problems, they don't have water. So the price of water has increased tremendously. Again, you see, if you have such a factor, a dominating factor, whose cost increases by 50 or 100%, you must pass on as much as possible to your customers. And of course, the tomato growers, the avocado growers, they have to sell to very powerful retailers, the Walmarts or the Aldis or the Lidls of this world. And you can imagine how tough that is when you want to negotiate higher prices with these guys.
Well, Herman, it feels like most companies have a tough time with this, at least in our experience. And I know your experience is much deeper, and you've done lots of research on this. But when we start to work with the sales organizations that we coach, they're not used to passing along price increases. They're typically not well versed in the conversation. They're always kind of on their back feet, if you will. They'll always feel very defensive in the conversation. And it sounds like to me, we're going to need this conversation much more frequently, because if we're in this period, a heavy period of inflation for 10 years, I think, David, we've got to be very careful when our sales teams go out to the market and they communicate a price increase. They have to be very careful not to commit that this is the only price increase you're going to be receiving for a certain period of time, because we have no idea.
Yeah. I was going to ask Herman that as well too, the same question, Mark. And one of the things that I really took from the last interview you had with Herman when I was listening to the podcast, this may not be that revolutionary, but price matters. And I think that the salespeople are most sensitive to the pricing, to the most part, because they get that from confidence. And I was really curious. I mean, to tag along to what you said, Mark, is what advice would you give like a sales manager such as myself, Herman, to have to communicate this to the sales team in a way that's positive and doesn't really knock the confidence out of their daily life? Because if they don't have that confidence, then they're going to have some issues when they try to have that conversation.
Sure they will.
Two aspects. The life for the sales guys is getting much harder. If you look back at the last decade or the last 3 decades, actually, we had an annual inflation of 2%. That means the sales person had to go once per year to the customer and ask for a modest price increase of 2%. Now let me take 2 leading tire manufacturers. Michelin, that's a global market leader, and Conti, that's a large German company. They have already increased their price 4 times this year.
Wow.
And are announcing further increases for the next month. Now imagine the poor sales guy coming to the customer and I was here months ago and now I come again with a price increase. And that, David, has two sides. One is, what does the salesperson communicate? And I think you have to try to shift him or her as much as possible to value communication. Because only if they can communicate a higher value, superior value, the customer is willing to accept a price increase. But in addition to that, you have to do some psychological hardening by preparing the salespeople to this tense, anemical situation. You can do that through role playing, preparing them by psychological training. So I see these 2 sides: content, shift to value communication, psychology makes them harder, that they can live with the increased pressure. And actually what I expect is more resignations from salespeople who are not able to stand this tougher situation. Yeah.
You're actually, isn't that interesting? So that let's call it that market correction's been coming for some time, Herman, because in professional sales, there's just been too much demand and not enough supply on high-end, top-tier salespeople for a long time. But isn't that interesting that for some of the older school salespeople who haven't been tying pricing to value, Prisium, that I learned from our last podcast, if that's correct, that David, in Roman times, there was one word for both. So price and value,
Pretium.
Pretium, that was some of the learning from our last podcast. And thank you, Herman, that we've always got to be thinking about how we add value.
Yeah. A very important aspect is that has nothing to do with inflation, but we have been observing that in many of our projects. When the sales force has price competencies, can decide on certain prices and discounts, that the contribution margins of individual salespeople were highly different.
Yes.
And the difference was explained whether they were value sellers or price sellers.
Yes.
The price sellers devoted much of their time with the customer to talking about price and discounts and conditions. And the value sellers devoted their time to communicate value. And in some of our projects, we recommended to replace price sellers by value sellers, which is a challenging recommendation and takes time. And you wouldn't believe how much that improved the margins of these companies who did that successfully.
Well, we see it all the time, Herman. I absolutely believe it, because those value sellers are always the top 30% of the sales organization, selling 70% of the volume, 80% of the volume. The one thing where I think in this kind of environment, even tactically, it's so helpful is a value seller by definition understands their client's business. They understand the business, the key performance indicators. They understand how that business gets measured in the marketplace, how they decide to compete and win, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think particularly with these pricing conversations, if as a value seller, I'm walking into a business, and before my conversation, I already know that they've increased their prices to their customers 4 times. If I'm going in to sell a Michelin, I might have an easier time with my conversation already knowing what they're doing in the market.
Yeah.
And so I think where some of the salespeople going a little blind, if they don't have that level of business acumen to actually understand what's happening with the client, then they feel, naturally apologetic.
Yeah, that's a precondition to know the processes, the value processes of your clients. But there's another change with inflation. In the value communication, you should focus more on hard values, economic advantages. Say if you explain, you want to sell a heat pump to a household or to a business.
Yes.
You should have hard data, what's the advantages compared to oil or gas heating. Because under these conditions of crisis, people want hard advantages, hard data, proof, and not soft things where you say, we are nice guys, we invite you for dinner, etc. Hard data to the largest degree possible.
Business cases.
Business cases. Yeah.
How do you actually
supported
help
by numbers and data?
Yeah, fantastic. So with all the companies that you get a line of sight into, Herman, where are you seeing the issues today regarding those price increases? Are they afraid to do it? They don't do enough of it? What are the issues that the community listening to this podcast should keep front of mind?
The fundamental issue is the pricing power. We recommend to assess it on an individual customer level.
Okay.
How big is our share? How easily can they replace us? Because that translates into setting objectives. How much can we achieve this with this customer? How big is the risk of losing customers? And we may have to lose some customers who don't bring us a sufficient contribution margin. And then another point is agility. When you think of the past, gradual, stable price cost changes, you could afford to be slow. You could observe a situation for several months. Now, things are changing every day. costs pop up, others go down. I just saw the oil price again is down at $94. 2 weeks ago, it was at 125. So your information must be agile. You must have for your price calculation daily data, and you must implement things very fast and not have your standard process, which takes a couple of weeks. Because if you are late and delay your reactions 3-4 months, the profit of the year is destroyed. And part of this is that it's better under these conditions to make more smaller price increases than, so more frequently increase your prices by smaller amounts or percentages than do it really by a higher amount.
That makes sense. You know, Herman, when I'm listening to you, I'm sort of getting excited in a way for a couple of reasons. First of all, I see some opportunity here in these times. And I think one of the opportunities that sort of is sparking my brain right now is this whole thing with the business cases, where I think that in these times where there's heightened sensitivity to how do we lower our costs, if you do have a strong value proposition, you might find yourself in a better position than you would in maybe times of regular inflation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it again depends. Let me give you one case from a very recent project. A company which made products with a high copper content. So the price of copper has gone up for years already, and a large part of their financial capacity was absorbed by buying and keeping the copper. And their old payment model was that the customer has to pay 6 weeks after the delivery of the products. Now they changed that the customer has to pay when he orders the product. And usually between order and delivery, there's 4 weeks. So they gained 10 weeks, which is very important for their finance. They actually got a better rating from the rating agency because of this shift in the time process of collecting their money, their receivables. And since they were strong enough, because of a limitation on the supply side, they could implement that. The customers accepted it.
How about that?
That leads again back to what inflation is: perishable money.
Perishable money.
And they get it 10 months, 10 weeks earlier, and they invest it immediately in buying new copper for to prevent that the value is going down of the money they keep.
I think an interesting point there, David, by the way, and Herman, is a lot of the organizations that we work with, when they're asking for when their clients are asking for terms on the money, it's not because they understand high-level inflation theory. It's actually because they have a logistics problem and an internal process problem paying vendors. But the purchasing groups doing negotiation, they actually don't care that much. They're not doing the math on the perishability of money or the time value of money. So these are easy ways, if we have intimacy with our customer, of getting something from them that's valuable to us without them giving up something they see as value, which is a pure definition of the win-win.
Another interesting trick, very practical. I don't know what the habits are in this way in the US. In Germany, Europe, we had a habit that the vendor offered usually a 2% discount if you pay within 8 days. And that had totally disappeared in the last years because it didn't matter whether you got your money immediately with the low interest rate. And last week, for the first time in years, I got an invoice from our electricians, which said 2% discount if you pay within 8 days. Of course, I paid immediately, and he has his money immediately.
There you go. We actually have that kind of discount with our energy providers.
How do you call it? We call it sconto, like that's a fixed.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what we call it, Herman.
Everybody used to do that in the 1970s and with higher, and in the last 10 years, it has totally disappeared. And now this smart guy immediately, I also recommended that in the book, give a small discount and you get your money within 8 days.
Well, fantastic. By the way, everybody listening, let's be the first to do that. They're going to get a lot of vendors asking for that, and partners. Be the first. It'll be an easy yes on their side. Talk to me a little bit, Herman, about our employees. So David's company, 6,000, 7,000 employees. We've got lots of organizations here managing talent on a regular basis. The employees hear about inflation, and their questions about their compensation start to come more frequently. Any thoughts or coaching for the senior leaders of those businesses who, as you aptly point out, they haven't been through this before, where inflation has gone at this rate? How do they address that critical conversation with logic and fairness with the employees?
You have to be a realist in this regard. Of course, the employees will demand higher wages. We already see that in Germany, where the unions, which are stronger here, but not as strong as they are in France, they demand wage increases 7-8% in this range. So that will be another factor which will drive inflation in the coming years. And I think you cannot avoid midterm, longer term to pay higher wages. That means you have to reduce the amount of labor. And we have anyway a very serious problem to find young, able people. There's a talent war. And if we lose people, that's disastrous. So I think the shift there is you shouldn't be too greedy on the wage side, but you should work hard on reducing the input of labor by digitalization, automation, higher efficiency, etc. So we will see this movement, this change from the money to the volume side of the labor input.
Well, this harken. I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's more opportunity for any salespeople listening out there to connect with some of their customers with some of these business cases, you know, because that can really offset some of the points that Herman just made. Now, Herman, I'm curious. You just wrote your own book, a new book that's only, and I may have a German last name, but I don't speak German, unfortunately. But you've got this new book coming out that I'm super excited about. Do you dive into some of the sort of, as Mark would say, tactical strategies for what businesses should do during this time?
Yes, we have a whole chapter. The title of the book is, by the way, Beating Inflation. And it will appear in 2 months by the earliest. I can send you the manuscript if you send me your email. And some technical things. The most important one is that you have a price escalation, price adjustment clause. And let me give you one example from America. Amazon has ordered 100,000 vans from Rivian, or you pronounce it Rivian, the electric van manufacturer.
Okay.
And Rivian gets the seats from a company whose name I don't remember. And they had agreed on a price without a sliding price escalation clause. Now, the seat manufacturer demands a duplication of the price because their increase cost has. So they're already at the court. This is a disaster. I mean, if Rivian has to pay double the price, their whole calculation will blow up. And if the seat manufacturer doesn't get more, they will probably go bust. So you must have a price adjustment clause if you are delivering only in a few months. Think of a trucking company. A big truck has a tank of 300 gallons. Now, if the price per gallon increases by only $1 or so, that's $300 more per tank charge, right? For one tank filling. And if you don't have, you can't pass that on contractually to your customers, you will end up in bankruptcy. So this is one important technical measure. Of course, I mentioned some others like the 2% discount for quick payment. You can also think of offering what I call LEA, less expensive alternative. I have an example from a chemical company in the book where you can only order for the less expensive variant a full truck load, a tanker full, with a delivery time which is very long, 20 days. And if you want to have any custom adjusted specification, this is not feasible. So by thinking, another tactical measure is to go from a sales price to a pay-per-use price. Michelin is an interesting example. Again, they introduced a truck tire which lasted 25% longer. Now, a truck tire costs, say, $1,000. You cannot increase that to $1,250. No trucker would accept that. So they switched to a model per mile.
Oh,
and there they can realize the higher price. They have special sensors which measure the mileage, and the trucking companies like it because if the truck is not busy, they don't have to pay anything for the tires. So one guy said to me, when do we change our price model if not now?
Right. Yeah. Well, by the way, what a great catalyst, right? The crisis, the opportunity.
Yeah.
When you use that pay-per-use, that takes me back 35 years, Herman, to the photocopy industry. They used to sell massive photocopiers. They kept going up in price. Then they started leasing them and playing around there. And then eventually they said, don't worry about it, just pay per copy.
Yeah.
And everybody, it was much
similar.
Yeah, these models exist if we want to apply that creativity. Again, in the book, Beating Inflation, tell us a little bit about, obviously the timing was spectacular, was so relevant for the times. I'm sure it's going to go through the roof. Tell us a little bit, get us a bit excited about the book, Herman. What's the structure and how do we beat inflation? How else do we beat inflation?
By looking at each function. Of course, understanding pricing power, price increases. I talked about the sales force. I mentioned purchasing. They have to find a balance between getting a good price and getting the products and all at all. I spoke about cash management, the 2% discount, or the model with the copper company, which shifted forward by 10 weeks, the inflow of the receivables. And so what the inflation requires is a culture change. And I also would like to point to one strange thing. There are quite a few studies in America and other countries, but I have the number for America. The question was asked to people in the street, if a company takes in $100, how much remains as net profit after taxes, after deduction of all costs? And the average answer in America is 31%. In Germany, it's 22%. The record holder are the Italians. There's the consumers in the street thinks that the companies have a net margin of 38%.
Okay.
Now, the true numbers are about 5% for the US, and Italy similar. Germany is actually lower. Now, if employees know how small the buffer is, the profit buffer is, and profit is the cost of survival, they will behave differently than if they think that companies have a net margin, a buffer of 30%. So I think entrepreneurs, companies should be more transparent, more open on what a narrow margin they are operating. And then people read in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times that Apple has a margin of net margin of 22%. I think that is the factor which explains. They think that is the economy. That has nothing to do with normal businesses like David Fauser's.
We be ecstatic at
the more realistic margin is about 5%.
Wow. So,
And if your employees know that, I would say they behave differently than if they think that your margin is 30%.
well, it's so interesting, guys, because many of the organizations that we work with are publicly traded companies, but those employees have never done the math on the P&L. It's staring right there in the end. It's staring right there in the public filing.
Yeah. And of course, there's so much deception and obfuscation because they talk of operating profit, EBITDA, which is of course much higher than the net profit. But EBITDA is nothing which you can keep. Profit, I have a book that's called True Profit. And true profit is only what the company can keep after it has fulfilled all obligations towards employees, customers, vendors, banks, the state. That's the only profit figure which counts, and that's about 5% on the average.
One of the notes I'd throw out to everybody listening today in professional sales and in business, elevating that level of business acumen is absolutely critical in this new world. We actually do have to understand basic financial models for our business, and then we very much have to understand the financial models of our clients' businesses. So that's where we're enabled to have a better conversation about leveraging some of these great strategies, Herman, because we're going to have to get better at very difficult conversations, obviously, for years to come. It does remind me, guys, again, I wasn't around in the 70s. For those watching, I might look like I was, but I wasn't around in the 70s. But certainly in the early 90s and mid 90s, when we were negotiating massive outsourcing contracts, the two most contentious clauses, no matter how big, hundreds of millions, even more, two most contentious clauses, limitation of liability, of course, they wanted to outsource the inherent liability in their business. We didn't want to take it. Number two, price escalator, because they were massive dollars. So people would die on the sword on that escalator. And we were just tying it to CPI, but it would be CPI, less energy. There'd be different ways of manipulating it up or down, or CPI plus 2% and so forth. And I think we're probably coming back into those days.
Yes, absolutely.
So Herman, as always, by the way, every time I talk to you, I feel like I get smarter. Unfortunately, because I'm not so sharp, it only lasts a short period of time, but you have this amazing way of distilling complex, models into simple terms that we can all understand. So first of all, thank you for that. And then secondly, we're so excited to read the book, Beating Inflation. And by the way, True Profit sitting behind you, Hidden Champions in the Chinese Century, and then Many Worlds, One Life. So we have one of the top 50 thinkers in the world with well north of 35 books to your credit. How else do people learn more about you, Herman, or Simon-Kucher Partners?
Yeah, the simplest way is to go to my homepage, hermansimon.com, Herman with 2 N, unlike in the American writing. And Simon-Kucher is simon-kucher.com.
It's wonderful.
And you find us everywhere. We have now 7 offices in the United States, about 2,000 people, 43 offices all over the world. Last year, we crossed 522 million, and this year we are growing again. So we would be happy to help you in your sales process and in your pricing process.
Fantastic.
I just have one last question, Mark, if you don't mind.
Please, David.
Sorry. With the 35, 37 books, sometimes I hear it's 40 books, Herman. We talked earlier about, one of the key skills here is shifting your sales force from value selling, from price focused selling. Do one of your books, if I'm like a sales manager out there listening, if I want to pick something up to start on that path, which one of your books would you recommend out of all the ones you've written that would best?
Then I would recommend Confessions of the Pricing Man.
Yeah, great.
Which appeared 4 years ago or so. Yeah.
Okay.
Confessions of the Pricing Man.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much.
So that one will be on our radar, I'm sure, of our required reading, David. First of all, Herman, thank you so very, very much for joining again. It's such a pleasure always speaking to you. David, thank you for managing this conversation with me again today. It's always a pleasure having you on the line. And folks listening, thank you for taking the time to listen. We run this podcast because our mission in life is to improve the performance and the professionalism of sales, and actually to help improve the lives of professional salespeople. So we just want to help people learn. If there's another way we can do that, we really want to hear from you. So if you enjoyed today's podcast, please like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast. Now, if you have some ideas for me, please share them. We love constructive criticism. My personal email is markcox@inthefunnel.com, markcox@inthefunnel.com. Give us your ideas. We love direct constructive criticism, and we'll see you next time on the Selling Well. David, what do you think of Hermann Simon?
Well, hey, Mark, listen, whenever you can get one of the top 50 thinkers in the world and you can have a one-on-one, I mean, what's there not to love about that conversation? So fitting for the times that we're in today. Sure.
You know, it's one of the joys, by the way, David, of doing this podcast has always been meeting these amazing people. You know, first of all, it's one of the joys of In the Funnel, meeting amazing people like you. But then we started this podcast and just meeting these amazing people, having this conversation. And as you know, we like these three things in life, attributes for salespeople like intelligence, drive, and humility. We're just chatting with somebody who's been named one of the top 50 thinkers in the world. You know, he's written 37 books, he's taught at every major school we can think of, including Harvard. It's just like the most humble, down-to-earth guy who's just super sharp at what he does, just amazingly sharp, simplifying these complex financial models so that anybody can understand them. It's just amazing to me, these conversations. We're so lucky to be able to engage people like this.
We certainly are, Mark, and he reminds me of that Albert Einstein quote that says the more you know about something, the more simply you can explain it. So obviously he is truly an expert on this subject. And one of the things I really love about doing this, Mark, personally, is that I could sit there and say, well, what can I ask this person? And I guess people that are listening out there, if they were to ask Herman a question, or if they wanted to, they could certainly send that email to you, because you have a direct link to Herman that maybe potentially you could ask him a burning question that one may have about inflation. Is that correct?
Of course. Yeah. The markcox@inthefunnel.com. You've got questions out there about inflation, the impact on your business, some of those things. We can absolutely, reach out to Herman and ask that question. And by the way, as we go through this journey in inflation, I don't think that'll be the last time we're going to talk to Herman.
I don't think so.
Maybe what we do, David, is we do a live webinar, and we get a live audience, and we have them all ask those questions, because I think about a year from now, which would be perfect timing, we're going to be knee deep in the impact of either a recession in certain parts of North America, or in certain parts of the world and North America, or inflation will be settling in for a long-term stay. And I think lots of us will have lots more questions for one of the best thinkers on this topic and many others in the world.
Absolutely, Mark. And the thing that, from anyone listening right now, and what I really took from that was the shift from being a price seller to a value seller. And you've talked about this since the day I met you, was this lack of the skill set in that area. And I think that if there's any time to reach out to somebody of your services in particular to try to start with that shift, I think that people should get on that. I mean, without giving you a shameless plug, I think that it's really the time that somebody like you could really step in and add a lot of value to help with that transformation.
Thanks, David. I've seen the need for this for 10 years. And so, any type of change in the marketplace, any type of change just keeps pushing the need further and further and further. And you've also been hearing for so long about there's going to be this culling of professional salespeople. There were this, Gardner and others said, 5 years ago, they said, oh, it's going to get cut by a third, and so on and so forth. And they were saying because of technology. I have a feeling moving forward, it's really going to become because of skill set or capability. And I don't think it's going to be a third, but I do think a lot of those folks in professional sales listening to this today, it's probably not anybody listening to this podcast, right? It's someone who would never listen to a podcast. If you can't make that shift to get from, price and product selling to value selling, you're not going to make it to, let's call it selling 4.0. You're just not going to get through. It's just too hard now. And given these tough days ahead in terms of inflation, it's going to get harder.
Right. But on the other side of the coin, Mark, those that do have that skill, talk about an opportunity financially and from a success perspective. And you know what? I think that, we could talk about, are you born with those or can you learn them? I absolutely think you could learn these skills. Yes. I just think that you just have to be open-minded with and try some new things and push yourself a little. But I do believe that, and I've seen it myself with some people that really don't fit that sales mold, but are extremely successful at selling, and they can get their proper coaching and an open attitude. So, that's the exciting part. I think up until this point, I was almost a little depressed about inflation to a certain extent. And I'm actually leaving this call, Mark, feeling pretty optimistic that there are opportunities out there, and there are things that we can do to try to help the team and help our company, come out of this in a better way.
Beautifully said, David. I've got nothing to add or build on. That's terrific. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, you got it, sir.